Hello and welcome. I'm Jenna Logue. The May 5th shootings of 2 gunmen by a police officer outside a Draw Mohammed contest in Garland, Texas, have intensified attention to the terrorist organization referred to most frequently as ISIS. A 20-year-old British computer hacker linked to the attack is an influential recruiter for ISIS. So what has all this to do with our guest? Well, Dr. Amy Kaufman, an associate professor in the MTSU Department of English, is director of conferences for the International Society for the Study of Medievalism. On April 16th, Dr. Kaufman presented a lecture at MTSU titled Dark Revival, ISIS Propaganda and the New Middle Ages. She posits that a good deal of the appeal ISIS has to disaffected and alienated youth is a romanticized concept of the Middle Ages, being acted out in the 21st century. And we're about to find out just what that means. So, Dr. Kaufman, it is great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Before delving specifically into ISIS, could you define, as a scholar of literature, the differences between the way the Middle Ages actually were and the way that these young ISIS recruits fantasize their life could be or perceive the Middle Ages?
Absolutely. I think that there's a notion of what the Middle Ages is and what it's like that is not specifically Islamic or specifically Western, but that permeates popular culture and comes to us largely from 19th century romanticized notions of the Middle Ages. So we imagine a world, and it has both positive and negative qualities. We imagine a world, for instance, that is extremely oppressive of women, in which there is no free speech to criticize something like faith or a king or a monarch. Those are some of the negative aspects, in addition to things like torture, brutality, intolerance, crusades, invasion. And yet there's kind of a positive romanticized aspect of that Middle Ages too. One of the most influential and most consistent romanticized aspects is medieval masculinity. So if you look at a show like Game of Thrones, which is probably the most popular example of medievalism today, you see a gritty and barbaric and brutal world, but you see one in which men are extremely masculine, are capable of heroic acts. No one questions their power or their authority, and they are forced to prove themselves on an epic scale, which I think is one of the important factors here. It's very difficult to feel heroic and to define yourself as a heroic figure, if you don't have a grand landscape on which to play out your heroism, if you don't have people you can cast as villains, if you don't have people you can cast as damsels in distress to rescue, and if you don't feel like the world is validating your power and your privilege.
When you say broad landscape, you don't mean just geographically, you mean societally as well.
I mean societally, yes, absolutely.
And this uber macho aspect to the propaganda fails to take into consideration the religious aspect of it all, or the way in which Islam is twisted and demented by the ideologist behind ISIS, but that's not really important to the young men who are being recruited, is it?
I wouldn't say it's unimportant. Religion is certainly a factor. And yet, what I would say is that the ability to use medievalism and propaganda in this way, and the pattern of using medievalism and propaganda in this way, is in no way unique to Islam. So in other words, any religious identity or political identity that has a nostalgia for a mythologized past can use this kind of propaganda and use it effectively.
Muslims would certainly say that Christians used that during the Crusades to great effect.
Well, and I've recently heard that a number of soldiers fighting in the Middle East are wearing Crusades patches.
Ah, I see.
In partly in response to this revival of the caliphate, but partly because it has the same heroic masculinist narrative, that kind of medieval hero fighting a, quote, just war. Well, I would say that Islam and religion are important to people who are going over. These are devout people. I would not say that this in any way represents the broader pattern of practicing Muslims in the world, not just in the West. That it is a religious motivation, but that is not what makes it medievalism. What they're drawing on is, in fact, a cultural pattern that crosses boundaries, across religions, across nations, into our popular entertainment.
And how does this fantasy proliferate in 21st century life? You mentioned video games. How else does it manifest itself?
We love it on television. Like I said, Game of Thrones, Vikings.
They said not just fictional TV, but non-fictional documentary TV too, right? Like the History Channel, I believe, was mentioned in one of your papers.
Yes, although the History Channel is doing a lot of fiction now. So the Viking show, for instance, is based loosely on a real saga from Icelandic literature, but that saga is itself a cross between fiction and history. So yeah, that show is most certainly fiction.
Right. And where does social media fit into all of this?
Social media is one of the most important factors in this, because the young people who are being recruited are incredibly isolated. And so more isolated than your average teenager in the United States or in Europe, which is still pretty isolated compared to, I think, maybe the way you or I grew up in a much more physical social community. So when you're a teenager, you find very much that people don't understand you. People in authority figures seem like they're often wrong. And so you turn to communities that validate you and support you and listen to you and tell you how misunderstood you are. And for some of us, that could be something like heavy metal music in the 1980s, right? Or the goth community or the punk community. But now people's primary interactions are with their computers and their iPhones, their Facebook pages, their Twitter accounts. And that's where these communities are forming. And that's where the ISIS recruiters are preying on young people with various kinds of propaganda. This can be anything from medieval seeming propaganda in Twitter feeds that show ISIS fighters posed as knights with scimitars riding on horses. It could be artwork. There are a number of pictures floating around online of a kind of hybrid ISIS fighter who looks like a cross between a samurai warrior and a medieval Christian crusader knight. And then there's personal messaging. Once you start looking at a page, you maybe contact a radical imam online, you maybe start posting to a discussion board, then recruiters will start contacting a young man or young woman personally. Particularly in the case of young women, they tend to message very romantically and very persuasively. And it's hard for me to remember as far back as being a teenager, but I think we all went through that experience of feeling like your friends were the only people that you could talk to, the only people who understood what it was you really wanted, and that's just what's happening here. It just happens to be virtual friends.
So youthful rebellion for someone between 18 and, say, 26 might manifest itself in the way that you dress, the way, what you do with your hair, what kind of music you like. It might even manifest itself in some risky behaviors like driving 100 miles an hour or, you know, engaging in drugs or whatever. But there's a far cry from that kind of youthful rebellion and the kind of youthful rebellion that results in human beings being beheaded.
Yes, although I would, there are two things to say in response to that. One is that many of the people going to join ISIS are going as computer programmers, as doctors, as brides, are going to support the community without expecting to engage in violence. I think that's something that we don't hear enough about.
No, we don't. But it makes sense that they would be a part of the caliphate if the caliphate is to exist.
Absolutely, right? That you would want to be part of a fledgling state in one way or another. And we all know through history and through current events that nations require war. And so that is not justification for this kind of violence in any way, but it does give you a little bit of insight into why people who are not violent specifically would be interested in going over and joining. But the other thing I would say is that we do have plenty of examples of teenage violence. Gang violence is a great parallel example. If you perceive yourself as being in a struggle for survival, then violence becomes a kind of necessary way of being.
Because all other systems in your way of thinking or to your way of thinking have failed
Have
you.
failed you.
Education has failed you, government has failed you, family has failed you.
And rejected you to a certain extent as well. In the case of young Western Muslims, it's often social rejection at school. It can be abuse that you see happening to your family members or to your friends. And many of them are motivated by wars abroad and watching abuse happen to their own people or their family's people.
This ISIS hacker linked to the Garland, Texas attack is male, 20 years old, British, and from a working class family in Birmingham. He's the son of a cafeteria worker. Does that fit the profile of the young man ISIS is trying to attract?
Yes, although I should say that I'm not particularly an expert in who they are recruiting so much as how they are recruiting.
Yeah.
But yes, they are looking for young, professional, westernized people. There's a myth that young people are used as cannon fodder when they come from the West and they go over, but that really isn't the case because they often have economic resources, or they simply have passports that will allow them to travel. They often speak multiple languages, and they often have skills, invaluable skills like computer skills that ISIS really needs.
So they're not necessarily using the Westerners' militaristic skill sets, they're using their intellectual skill sets.
Yeah, they often come with no military training at all, and they either have to be trained or they're simply not used as fighters.
And yet, with the religious dichotomy in play here, there was a professor named John Esposito who works at Georgetown University, and he said at an event that was sponsored by the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs that two of the most popular books read by ISIS recruits are Islam for Dummies and Quran for Dummies. So they're studying up on what they need to know in order to fit into this new society.
Absolutely, yeah. This is one of the ways in which religion is not the prime motivator for this kind of rebellion, and I think it really is rebellion. Not just a bunch of murderous people lurking in the country, but a normal process for young adults that happens to have this radical form of expression that is just not available to many young adults. Although you do see, this is something I wanted to bring up before, you do see it in occasional people like young people who do school shootings and movie theaters. They've often been radicalized in their own way online, just not having anything to do with religion in particular. The Quran, and actually any religious text, is a complex thing. This is one of the points that I bring up in my lecture and some of my writings, which is that any religious text is not a book that you can necessarily encounter one-on-one in translation, literally, and just get it. That's why there are so many people interpreting and arguing over interpretations, and that continues to happen even in radical fundamentalist communities, radical fundamentalist Islamic communities online, because the words are not immediately clear and they're not meant to be, right? The words in religious texts are meant to lead us to deeper spiritual truths. So knowing what they need to know just to understand the religion fully would take years and years and years. You need to become a religious scholar in order to do that. So it doesn't surprise me that they're reading quick things that can allow them to assimilate and understand at least what their perceived foundling nation is doing. But then there's also a very practical reason for that too, which is that ISIS is carefully rooting out spies and infiltrators and enemies who are coming to the border to study them or to subvert them. And so one of the things that they'll do is quiz people on the Quran.
So if you slip in your knowledge of Islam, then you will come under suspicion.
Yes, and it does also have to be a very specific version, a very specific interpretation of Sunni Islam, of radical Sunni Islam, that if you are not a practicing Sunni, if you're Shiite in particular, you could be not only barred from entry, but probably killed.
Where do women fit into the fantasized picture of medievalism? Are they ladies fair to be saved by knights errant, or are they property, or where do they fit into the picture?
I think that the first is the most attractive version, but of course there's a radical split between women who are recruited to be brides, proper Islamic brides, and women who are used as sex slaves, concubines, raped multiple times, and murdered.
It sounds kind of like a Madonna horror complex.
That's precisely what I was going to say. Yes, that's precisely it, right? The good, obedient, religious woman is valued as a bride and the mother of sons and children, and the errant woman, or the woman who practices the wrong religion, is punished very severely.
And how can it be explained that ISIS is recruiting women to ride herd over rape fests and police the dress and deportment of women? This is women terrorizing women. Where does that fit into the picture?
I think we all have a rosy idea that when someone is a member of an oppressed group, that they will always want to fight back. In many ways, it's easier to join. There is a semblance of power. If you are a woman and you're enforcing laws against other women, then that gives you an element of power that you wouldn't otherwise have if you were simply fighting the system. If it's encoded into moral or religious doctrine, that makes it even easier to do. Joining the oppressor is a way of surviving. It's also a way of elevating yourself. It's a very simple psychological answer, I think, even though it's a distasteful one.
It could either be the Stockholm Syndrome, or it could be a kind of a Machiavellian road up the path to power.
I think it's perhaps a little bit of both, but I don't think that ideology of women attacking women is exclusive to what's going on in ISIS.
No,
I mean, I think you see it quite a bit throughout culture. So,
if you're a woman and you're married to an ISIS fighter and he becomes a martyr to the cause, does your stock go up?
Yes.
In the society?
Yes, your stock goes up in the society. Theoretically, we don't have a lot of reports of what's actually happening to women on the ground there, other than the Yazidi women who were released from captivity, and their tales are all horrible stories of being held captive. There are a few women who have contacted their families through social media. I should say girls. They go over quite young, 12, 13, 14, to say that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be living over there, but their communications are very strongly policed. So a lot of what we know about what happens to women in ISIS is what ISIS wants us to know. So theoretically, yes, you are elevated if your husband is martyred. In practice, who knows?
There are some parallels that you drew in your April presentation between the fantasy and some things that hit a little bit closer to home for Americans, like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, who literally call themselves knights. And the fantasized concept of the American South is this beautiful place to live until the slaves got freed, and that just totally messed everything up. And we're fighting for states' rights, standing our ground, so forth and so on. Or the Nazis' demonization of Jews as vermin during World War II and Holocaust. What do these fantasies say about the role of and the power of fantasy in our lives?
Well, I think they speak to the power of a very specific kind of fantasy. The fantasy that there is a pure place in the past that was an orderly system where everything worked the way it was supposed to, in some cases ordained by God, where social boundaries were enforced rather than threatened. So I think it's an extremely conservative, nostalgic fantasy. And the Middle Ages plays an important role there because the Middle Ages plays an important role in the way that we define ourselves today. We either see it as backwards and we see ourselves as having made a ton of progress, right, and everything is so much better, or we see it as a purer, more heroic, more beautiful time.
Or if you reject it altogether, you see yourself as a Renaissance man, quote unquote.
Precisely, yes, and you define yourself against everything that supposedly happened in the Middle Ages, but debunking that would be a whole other show, I think.
It would take another hour.
It would take another hour. So the real appeal of those fantasies is the appeal of hierarchy, power, and order. In the and it tends to rise up when identities are threatened, particularly the identities of the people who have the most power in society. So there was a rise in medievalism in the 19th century, both in Europe and in the United States. In Europe, because of problems with colonialism, of women agitating for rights, of slaves agitating for rights and being freed 100 years earlier in England than they were over here. And then in the late 19th century, the Civil War and the Emancipation Act, feminism again, women advocating for votes over here, and Reconstruction, where people in the South who had formerly been in a position of power if they were landowners or if they were poorer white slaves, at least had some kind of superiority over someone and some kind of job security and social status. So all that all ripped away in a moment, or seemed like a moment. It seemed like agony and eternity if you were on the other side. And so those are powerful moments for people looking to the past for the way that things were. The Southern slaveholders had already painted themselves as landed feudal knights, and it was only a few imaginative steps away to imagine themselves as crusading knights taking back the land. For Nazi Germany, we sometimes see Hitler as coming from out of nowhere, but it was very, very slow, methodical process from 19th century nationalism to the 1930s Holocaust. It was a buildup of ideologies that recalled the Teutonic past, where Hitler made deliberate, not just Hitler personally, but the whole Third Reich, including its scholars, made deliberate connections between German medieval folklore and Old Norse, where you had the really Aryan Viking style manly white man, in order to show that Germany needed to go back to its roots to purify itself. So in many ways, that's what's happening here with ISIS, is that they want to go back to the roots of the caliphate, not in the way that it actually was, because the medieval Islamic world was notoriously tolerant. Jews would leave Europe, Western Europe, where they were either thrown out by law or just subjected to incredible violence and discrimination, and they would go thrive in the Arab world and in Islamic culture, where they were second-class citizens, but they could rise to certain levels of power. They weren't in fear for their lives all the time. So what ISIS wants to go back to is not a real place.
No.
I think the best thing I could say is that it's to them, utopian, to us, dystopian future that takes on aspects of medieval fantasy, but doesn't work in the way that the real medieval world worked.
And in the real medieval world, wasn't there more of a connection between religion and rational thought than there was between religion and extremism?
Yes, that's precisely right. Fundamentalism, which so for our purposes we can define as reading religious texts literally and acting on them literally, that's a movement that doesn't start until the 1900s. In Islam, in Judaism, or in Christianity. It is actually a modern movement. In the Middle Ages, religion and intellectual curiosity and questioning and debate and argument and query, all of these things were inextricable from each other. Faith could also be criticized. I was thinking about the shooting in Texas, about how I had a professor who said that he went to Boston College in the 1950s, and the Canterbury Tales was kept in a glass case, locked, and you had to get permission from two people to read it because it was so critical of the Catholic Church. When Chaucer wrote, though, I'm not sure how familiar your viewers will be with high school Canterbury Tales. It's very, very condemning of various orders of the church. And when Chaucer wrote, that was just part of the conversation. People criticized the church all the time.
It wasn't as though he had written it during the Spanish Inquisition.
No, precisely. The Inquisition is another animal entirely. But in many ways, there was more of an understanding of religion as something that was fluid, that should evolve. that should be reasoned out and questioned than there is today in a lot of circles.
It seems the concept, if I understand correctly, of freedom in the minds of those who adopt the fantasized view of the Middle Ages is different from our concept of freedom, especially in the young men's minds.
Yes.
Mature adults know that freedom and responsibility go hand in hand, but for these young men who are being recruited by ISIS, the definition of freedom is a sense of entitlement, a sense of domination, a sense of being able to do anything you want, whenever you want, regardless of the consequences.
Yes, it's power. It's the fantasy of power that we sell in our all of our medieval entertainment, right? The most successful person is the one who does the most killing and takes the most. ISIS uses Grand Theft Auto in its recruiting videos. It says you can play out a real life Grand Theft Auto here. It uses Lord of the Rings, which is very perplexing to a lot of Tolkienites like myself. Actually, it's not that perplexing, right? It's a heroic struggle. People conquer things against all odds. They conquer their enemies, and they do it by acting out, by being violent.
But it's an interpretation of Tolkien that Tolkien never had in mind.
Tolkien would be rolling in his grave. Yeah, I think in fact a lot of us are rolling around still alive. But yeah, so what you are sold, we talked about what young women are sold because that's more puzzling. Why would you go over there? But what you are sold as a young man going over there is that you will be a powerful person. You will have women available to you as wives and as slaves and as concubines and as victims. And you will be socially elevated. The other thing that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the news that maybe should be even more disturbing if you're interested in dismantling ISIS is that they're setting up incredibly comprehensive social structures. Free education, they have a post office, they have roads, they will clothe you and feed you if you join. So you will be taken care of. You will not have to fend for yourself if you go.
These are the perks.
These are the perks. Yeah, I mean, there are the uglier perks, which I just mentioned, but there are much more realistic perks. Now, no one knows how long they're going to be able to sustain that kind of social welfare because right now they're getting money from selling oil because they've conquered many of the oil fields. But if they run out of money, then that will create some problems.
Black market oil is supposedly one way they're helping to finance their activities.
Absolutely, the biggest way, yeah.
I think it's fascinating to view the subject of ISIS through this romanticized Middle Ages version of a new life, a sense of adventure and everything. And I think for those who say, well, why are you trying to even understand what's going on? It behooves us to try to understand someone who is attempting to dismantle your way of life. If you expect to protect it, it's not the same thing as rationalizing or justifying the activities that are taking place. But to attempt to dissect it is very much an instructive tool. And looking at it through literature, I think, is a very unique way and a very important way to try to wrap your brain around what's going on. Thank you. Dr. Amy Kaufman, greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.